everyone. So today we're going to be talking about Jeremiah. I've heard a lot of Jeremiah being referred to as the weeping prophet because he always seems to be crying and wailing over something in all of his prophecies, with good reason, to be fair. But today I want to look at how Jeremiah is more of our faithful prophet, that we can turn to him as an example of faith in God and just being very resilient and true to what God has for us. So, kind of a little off topic. Raise your hand if you went to a wedding this summer. I think I went to like 6 weddings. One of them was my own. But it just seems like this time of life is like the time to get married. And we all know that after the time to get married is the time to have babies. And multiple of my friends who have got married in the last few years are starting to have kids. So I want to introduce you to, this is little baby Hiller. She's about the size of a lime. She's 12 weeks old. You can kind of see her, she's real little. He or she, we don't know. But what I want to talk about today is the plans that God has for us. And we know that God has plans for us and has called us to do something before we're even born. So this little baby, God already knows what that little baby's going to do. He already has plans for he or she. You know, he already knows who they're going to marry, who their kids will be, what things, amazing things that they could do for his kingdom. So we know that God has plans for us before we're born, and that can be a comforting thing to think that, like, oh, God has called us and he already has it all under control, he's got it down, he knows what's going to happen. But it can also be really almost scary to think that God has called all of us to do something for his kingdom, and we may not know what that is, and we may not know how to go about doing it or even finding out what he wants us to do. And it can be intimidating to know that God has a purpose for us. And so sometimes when we feel called to do something for God, we try to make an excuse to get out of doing it. We say, oh, I can't do that. We know that Moses said, I can't speak to Pharaoh, I don't speak well. And what Jeremiah, we see, did, he said that he was too young. God called him to speak to the nations for him, and Jeremiah said, I can't do that, I'm too young. So I want to read to you guys real quick what Jeremiah's call was. The Lord gave me this message, me being Jeremiah. I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you as my prophet to the nations. Oh, sovereign Lord, I said, I can't speak for you. I'm too young. The Lord replied, don't say I am too young, for you must go wherever I send you and say whatever I tell you. Don't be afraid of the people, for I'll be with you and I'll protect you. I, the Lord, have spoken. Then the Lord reached out and touched my mouth and said, look, I've put words in your mouth. Today I appoint you to stand up against the nations and the kingdoms. Some you must uproot and tear down and destroy and overthrow, but others you're going to build up and plant. This is a pretty big job description, and I really don't blame Jeremiah for trying to get out of it, especially when we look at the context that this is in and the times that Jeremiah was living in. To say, go to the people and tell them what I'm going to do was a pretty terrifying thing. And so Jeremiah tried to get out of it. He said, I can't do it, I'm too young. But God already had this planned out. He already knew what Jeremiah was going to do before he was even born. So I want to look at the historical context that Jeremiah was living in a little bit. When Jeremiah was a prophet, the last good king that Israel had just died. Israel was God's chosen people, and God had led them into the promised land. But now the people weren't listening. They were sinning. They decided to have kings instead of just following God and the people that he had appointed. And so they started choosing kings that were doing awful things. The kings weren't listening to God. The Torah, the book with all of the rules and the laws and the instructions for how the people should live, they literally lost. They misplaced it in one of the back rooms of the temple, so they decided, we don't have God's rules anymore. We'll just make up our own. We'll be fine. So they started doing all of these awful things. They decided to have allies with all of the nations that they had just been trying to destroy in the land of Canaan. They were doing awful, awful things, and they thought that they were perfectly fine. They didn't see any problem with what they had, but it was obviously against God's laws. And so God called Jeremiah to say, go to my people, tell them they're not doing the right thing, tell them what I'm going to do if they don't stop. And God had chosen at this time that he was going to send Babylon into Israel to defeat them and to send his people into exile because they weren't listening. And so he told Jeremiah, go tell the people that they're going to die soon. Go tell them that, I'm very angry with them. And this was not this is not good news to hear. Like, none of us like to hear what we're doing wrong, or if we're sinning. We don't like to have people confront us. And so the people of Israel were not happy that Jeremiah was telling them all of these things. So Jeremiah was really the last good prophet that Israel had. You know, there was a lot of prophets, but when Jeremiah was a prophet, it was during his time that the people did go into exile. And he really, at the beginning of his ministry, I don't think Jeremiah wanted to be in that position, because that's a terrifying job. You know, I don't think any of us would like to go to an entire country and tell them, like, you're wrong, you're not doing the right thing, God's angry with you. But Jeremiah was obedient, and yet I'm sure that he was very terrified of this job description. But God knew this, and God reassured him. God said to him, "Get up and prepare for action. Go out and tell them everything that I tell you. Don't be afraid of them, or I will make you look foolish in front of them. For see, today I have made you strong like a fortified city that cannot be captured, like an iron pillar or a bronze wall. You will stand against the whole land, the kings, the officials, the priests, and the people of Judah. They will fight you, but they will fail. For I am with you, and I will take care of you. I, the Lord, have spoken." You know, again, this is a job description that I wouldn't like to have. But we see that God has promised to be with Jeremiah. God calls us to things. He's gifted us to all sorts of different things. And he has things that he wants us to do. But he never calls us to something and says, "Go do that, and I'll stand over here and kind of watch." You know, if God calls us to something, he promises to be with us every step of the way and give us what we need to fulfill what he has called us to do. You know, God does not in any way try to make Jeremiah's job sound easier. You know, God knows that this is a big mission that he's called Jeremiah to. But he promises to never leave Jeremiah to do the work alone. So Jeremiah was obedient. He was an obedient prophet. And so he went about to the people of Israel and to the people of Judah, and he told them what God told him to say. Like I said, nobody likes being confronted. Nobody likes being told that they're sinning or that they're not doing the right thing. So the people were not happy with what Jeremiah had to say. And I'm going to tell you some of the things that Jeremiah told them. And I'd be upset if I heard them too. They're pretty intense things. Some of them kind of funny, almost. You know, the people of Israel were worshiping false gods. They decided, we don't want to worship that Yahweh guy. We're going to worship our own people. That's probably better. So they were worshiping false gods. They were being idolaters. You know, they were supposed to be the bride of Christ, God's chosen people, and they decided, no, we're going to go worship this other guy instead. So Jeremiah told them that they were like an unfaithful bride. You know, you are like a wife who has gone astray. He said, you are such an unfaithful bride that a prostitute could learn a few tricks from you. He said that they were rebellious. They were wayward children. You know, he told them that they thought they were doing okay just because they had the temple, therefore God was dwelling with them. But God wasn't dwelling with his people anymore because they were being so sinful and so unfaithful to him. Jeremiah told them that Babylon would come through and destroy them and that they would get sent into exile. All of these things the people were not happy to hear. And so they reacted by attacking Jeremiah. They persecuted him. They threw him into prison. They beat him. In general, they just didn't listen to what he was saying. And if any of you are in ministry, if you've ever felt called to do something for God, and you were working, you were doing your best, and you thought that you were doing everything that God had called you to do, and it just wasn't working, I felt like nobody was listening. Everything that you thought God had planned for you just wasn't happening. This was very frustrating for Jeremiah. Not only was he being physically persecuted, but if he felt alone. You know, one thing that God told him specifically to do was never to get married. You know, that's hard for a lot of us who are married or would like to be married. You know, we want to have that partner in life, and Jeremiah, he couldn't. God told him not to. He said that this is your mission alone. So Jeremiah felt alone in his ministry. He felt that he was doing everything that God told him to do and it wasn't working. You know, he felt that God had abandoned him at times. So he felt all of this physical agony and pain from the people, but he also was just in emotional turmoil. Because Jeremiah had a heart for his people. These were his people, his family, his friends, you know, his hometown that he had grown up in, and they were doing awful things. They weren't listening. They weren't listening to him. They weren't listening to God. They were sinning up a storm, and Jeremiah was just heartbroken of the future that they had and what they were doing. So he was in physical pain, he felt abandoned, he felt alone, and he was heartbroken over his people. That's probably why they call him the weeping prophet, because, there's so much pain that he went through. And on top of all of that, the things that God was calling him to do seemed, at least when I read it, pretty nuts, pretty crazy, the things that God calls him to do. At one point, God tells Jeremiah to take an oxen's yoke and put it on your shoulders and wear it around as a point, to make a point to the people that they are being enslaved to other nations, like an oxen is enslaved to its master. I want you to run through the streets and just proclaim Israel's destruction. Have you ever seen those people on the street corners just saying, the end is near, God's angry with you, Those street corner preachers is kind of what Jeremiah sounds like. And the people didn't like it. He looked a little crazy, but it's what God called him to do. That just goes to show that God has plans for us, but sometimes those plans don't make sense to us at all. We may feel called or led to do something, and we say, God, why would I do that? That doesn't make any sense. But we have to trust God, because Jeremiah couldn't see the full picture completely. We can't see the full picture. God has plans for us before we're born, and when we're in the middle of it, sometimes it doesn't make sense, but we just need to keep on going and trusting God that he does have a plan for us. Eventually in Jeremiah's life, he reached a point that he just couldn't take it anymore. There is too much going on and too much pain and too much frustration, and he just cries out to God in this complaint. He said, Lord, you know what's happening to me. Step in and help me. Punish my persecutors. Please just give me more time. Don't let me die young like this. It's for your sake that I'm suffering. When I first discovered your words, I devoured them. They are my joy, my heart's delight, for I bear your name, O Lord. I never joined the people in their merry feast. I always sat alone, because your hand was on me. I was filled with indignation at their sins. Why then does my suffering continue? Why is my wound so incurable? Your help seems as uncertain as a seasonal brook, like a spring that has gone dry. Jeremiah is so frustrated because he feels like he's been doing everything that God calls him to do, but it's not working. It feels that God has abandoned him in his mission. Your help is uncertain as a seasonal brook. Jeremiah just doesn't feel like God is always there like he promised he would be. But God never left Jeremiah, and so he responded. He said, if you will return to me, I'll restore you, so you can continue to serve me. If you speak good words rather than worthless ones, you will be my spokesman. You must influence them, but don't let them influence you. They will fight against you like an attacking army, but I will make you as secure as a fortified wall of bronze. They will not conquer you, for I am with you to protect you and rescue you. I, the Lord, have spoken. Yes, I will certainly keep you safe from these wicked men. I will rescue you from their cruel hands. God never left Jeremiah. God never leaves us in our ministries when we feel called to do something for God and it just doesn't seem to be working, or we don't know what God is doing in our life. It may seem like the world is overcoming us, but God has promised. He has told us, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. They will fight against you like an attacking army, but I will make you strong. He says, you must be the one to influence them. Do not let the world influence you. Don't be overcome by the world, for I am stronger than the world. We know that. So God encourages Jeremiah. He equips him. He gives him everything that he needs to do his ministry. And Jeremiah does do some pretty amazing things, but not without a fair amount of struggle. Some of the greatest prophecies that Jeremiah made were when he was in prison in a dungeon, 2 feet deep in mud and slime, in prison for years, is when he did some of his best work. It's from Jeremiah that we hear that God won't be angry with his people forever. He will restore them. He will come and rescue them. Jeremiah tells us about the new covenant that God's going to make with his people someday. Jeremiah has hope that God will fulfill what he has said that he would do. And I'd love to tell you that Jeremiah has a really happy ending and that the people of Israel started listening and obeying and they all repented and it was great. But we know that that didn't happen. We know that they did go into exile and they did suffer. So this isn't to say that, if we trust in God, everything will always go great. We know that we're going to suffer sometimes, and that if we're following God and we're trusting in Him, life is going to be rocky sometimes. But we know that God is for us, and that He has a plan for us before we were even born, when we're still the little size of a lime in our mother's stomach. God knew what was going to happen. He knew the troubles that we would face. God has called you to something, and your weaknesses, and all the things, the excuses that you would like to make, you know, God called you even though he knew that Jeremiah was young. You know, he called Moses even though he knew that he couldn't speak well. You know, God knows your weaknesses and the things that you struggle with, and he's called you anyways. Because I heard once a good saying to remember, God does not call the equipped, but he equips the called. He didn't call you because you were good at preaching, or you're good at playing the guitar, or you love to, you know, hang out with teenagers. Like, those are good things. But he didn't call you because of that. You know, he called you because he has plans for you, whether, you know, you feel equipped enough to do them or not. Because he has promised to be there for us and give us everything that we need when we're there in the moment. So it's okay to doubt and question our call as long as we go to God with those questions. Just like Jeremiah struggled and he was frustrated and he went through so much pain, he always went back to God as his source of comfort and his source of strength. So when you're frustrated in life and you feel like everything that God promised for you just isn't working out and it's not going well and you don't know what he wants you to do, turn to God as your source of comfort. When you're doubting, question him, you know, seek answers from him. Go to him as your source of strength, because God has promised to always be with us, to always be there for us. He will never abandon us. He is always for us. So that's just my encouragement for you, is to always just keep pushing forward, always rely on God. He's called you to do something amazing. You know, we're in this preaching class learning, preparing how to, you know, serve his people and to teach his word. You know, he's called all of us, and it's going to be hard sometimes, and the people we're preaching to aren't going to listen. You know, we're going to feel like the call that God has for us just isn't working out. But we know that God is with us, and that he loves us, and he is going to empower us to do everything that he's called us to do.